Dr. William Hayes froze mid-incision, his scalpel suspended over the exposed tissue. The metallic scraping sound that echoed through Mass General's operating room defied everything he knew about human anatomy. It wasn't fatty tissue beneath James Sullivan's weathered skin, it was steel. Surgical nurse Jenny Martinez stumbled backward, her tray of instruments clattering to the floor like scattered prayers. The anesthesiologist's monitor beeped frantically as if sensing the room's collective shock. Even the seasoned OR technician, who'd seen 30 years of medical mysteries, stood paralyzed. James Sullivan had walked into this hospital complaining of back pain, the same gentle grandfather who played catch with his grandchildren every Sunday after Mass. Now he lay unconscious, harboring a secret that had been eating him alive for over 3 decades. "Call security," Hayes whispered, his voice barely audible above the ventilator's rhythmic breathing. "And get Detective Thompson on the line." What had this sweet old man been hiding? And how long before his family discovered the chilling truth buried beneath their father's skin? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, James Sullivan sat in his favorite chair, Martha's chair really, watching the morning sun filter through the lace curtains she'd hung 43 years ago. The empty coffee cup in his weathered hand still bore traces of lipstick from when she'd used it last, 3 years and 4 months ago. He couldn't bring himself to wash it completely. "Another day, Marty," he whispered to her photograph on the mantel, his thick Boston accent softening her name like a prayer. "Wish you were here to see the Sox are finally playing decent ball." The familiar ache in his lower back flared as he shifted positions, a constant companion that had grown from whisper to shout over the past year. At 67, James figured pain was just the price of admission for a life well lived. 32 years fighting fires in Southie, crawling through smoke-filled tenements and carrying unconscious victims down endless flights of stairs. His body had earned every creaking joint and stubborn muscle. The 3-story brownstone on Dorchester Street held 45 years of memories in its worn brick walls. Martha's recipe cards still cluttered the kitchen counter, her handwriting faded but legible. Jimmy's favorite pot roast and Sunday gravy, extra garlic. Her reading glasses sat folded on the coffee table beside a half-finished crossword puzzle from the day she'd gone into the hospital for the last time. James had retired from the Boston Fire Department 3 years ago, not by choice, but by necessity. The department doc had taken one look at his X-rays and declared him structurally compromised. The pension barely covered the mortgage and heating bills, leaving little room for luxuries like proper medical care or the medications Dr. Kim kept prescribing for his blood pressure. Every Sunday, his son Danny brought the grandchildren for dinner. 8-year-old Tommy would race up the front steps, his Red Sox cap askew, while 6-year-old Katie followed with gap-toothed grins and crayon drawings for Grandpa's refrigerator gallery. Danny's wife Sarah, a school nurse with kind eyes and infinite patience, would watch James move through the house and frown at his careful, measured steps. "Dad, you're walking like you're 90. She'd observed last weekend, her professional concern barely masked by familial affection. James had laughed it off with his usual deflection. "Can't complain. Still above ground, aren't I?" But the truth gnawed at him during sleepless nights. When the pain kept him pacing the hardwood floors Martha had insisted on refinishing 20 years ago. Something was wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. The ache had evolved from the familiar burn of overworked muscles to something darker, something that pressed against his spine like a cold, insistent finger. He'd survived house fires, chemical explosions, and the cancer scare that had nearly claimed Martha in 1992. Whatever was happening to his body now felt different, more patient than cancer, but just as relentless. Like something had been waiting inside him, biding its time, preparing to collect a debt he didn't remember owing. The collapse happened on a Sunday, as most disasters do, quietly, without fanfare, in the middle of ordinary happiness. James had been lifting 6-year-old Katie onto his shoulders for their traditional airplane ride around the living room when the pain struck like lightning through his lower back. One moment he was swooping her through the air, her delighted squeals filling the house with the kind of joy Martha would have treasured. The next, he was on his knees beside the coffee table, gasping for breath, while Katie's small hands patted his shoulders in confusion. "Grandpa? Grandpa, did I hurt you?" The room went silent except for the Sunday Red Sox game murmuring from the television. Danny dropped his fork onto his plate of Martha's famous pot roast, the recipe Sarah had learned by heart, though it never tasted quite the same. 8-year-old Tommy stopped mid-sentence in his animated retelling of Little League practice, his mouth forming a perfect O of concern. Sarah was beside James before anyone else could move, her nurse's training overriding her role as daughter-in-law. Her fingers found his pulse while she scanned his face for signs of cardiac distress. "James, talk to me. Is it your chest? Your arm?" "Lower back," he managed through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the October chill creeping through the old windows. Something's really wrong, Sarah." Danny knelt on James's other side, his construction-calloused hands hovering uselessly over his father's shoulders. For 37 years, Danny Sullivan had watched his father charge into burning buildings, carry unconscious strangers to safety, and face down every crisis with the steady calm that had made him a legend at Engine Company 33. Seeing him crumpled on the living room floor, vulnerable and afraid, shattered something fundamental in Danny's understanding of the world. "Dad, enough is enough," Danny said, his voice carrying the authority he'd inherited from James himself. "You're seeing a doctor tomorrow." "I don't need some young doctor telling me what I already know," James protested weakly, but the fight had gone out of him. The pain was different now. Not the familiar ache of overused muscles, but something sharp and insistent, like a blade pressing against his spine from the inside. Katie climbed down from the couch and approached cautiously, her small face serious with the gravity only children can muster in crisis. "Grandpa, are you going to die like Grandma?" The question hung in the air like smoke from one of Martha's old cigarettes, heavy and impossible to clear. James looked up at his granddaughter's earnest brown eyes, Martha's eyes, and felt something break loose in his chest. "No, sweetheart," he whispered, reaching out to touch her face with a trembling hand. "Grandpa's gonna fight." That night, alone in the bedroom he'd shared with Martha for 4 decades, James sat on the edge of their bed and stared at her photograph on the nightstand. The pain had settled into a deep, throbbing presence that made sleep impossible. He reached for her diary, the leather-bound book she'd written in every night for 30 years, but couldn't bring himself to open it. Some conversations with the dead required preparation he didn't have. "Martha, I'm scared," he admitted to the empty room, his voice barely audible above the October wind rattling the windows. "I don't know what's happening to me, and I don't know how to tell the kids if it's something bad." The photograph didn't answer, but he could almost hear her voice anyway. "James Michael Sullivan, you stubborn Irish fool. You'll tell them the truth, same as you always have, and you'll let them help you, because that's what families do." The next morning, Sarah drove him to Dr. Patricia Kim's office on Beacon Street, the same family practice where Martha had received her final diagnosis 3 years ago. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant and anxiety, filled with the quietly desperate faces of people hoping for good news they probably wouldn't receive. Dr. Kim, a slight woman in her 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, examined the X-rays with the studied neutrality that medical professionals wore like armor. But James caught the subtle tightening around her eyes, the way she tilted her head slightly when something on the screen didn't match her expectations. "Mr. Sullivan," she said finally, setting down the films and turning to face him directly. "I'm seeing a significant mass in your lower lumbar region. It's pressing against your spinal cord, which explains the increasing pain and mobility issues." The words hit him like cold water. "Cancer? We'll need more detailed imaging to determine that." "But James?" She leaned forward, her professional mask slipping slightly. "This needs immediate attention. I'm referring you to Mass General for a CT scan and surgical consultation. This can't wait." James stared at the X-ray images illuminated on the wall, seeing the shadow that had been growing inside him like some patient, malevolent thing. 43 years of marriage, 32 years of fighting fires, 67 years of life. And it might all come down to this: a dark shape on a medical film, waiting to steal whatever time he had left with his family. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Let's get the tests done first," Dr. Kim replied, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know about the urgency of his situation. The pre-dawn darkness of Mass General Hospital carried the hushed urgency of a place where life and death decisions happened before most people finished their first cup of coffee. James Sullivan sat in the surgical prep area at 5:30 a.m., his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching the controlled chaos of nurses and orderlies preparing for another day of miracles and tragedies. He hadn't been able to eat anything since midnight, hospital protocol, but the empty coffee cup beside him still held the phantom taste of his last normal morning. Danny sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside the gurney, his usually steady contractor's hands fidgeting with the bill of his Red Sox cap, the same nervous gesture he'd inherited from his father. "Dad, remember when I broke my arm falling off Mrs. Murphy's fence?" Danny asked suddenly, his voice carrying the forced lightness people use when they're trying not to think about worst-case scenarios. "You told me Sullivan men don't quit, even when the odds look bad." James managed a weak smile, remembering 9-year-old Danny with tears streaming down his face, convinced his Little League season was over. "You played the rest of the season with a cast, batted .340, if I recall correctly. Because you taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is keep swinging." Dr. William Hayes appeared in the doorway, his surgical scrubs crisp and his manner professionally reassuring. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd performed thousands of operations, though James noticed the slight tension around his eyes, the look of a surgeon who'd reviewed the case files multiple times and found something that didn't quite fit the textbook patterns. "Mr. Sullivan, we're ready for you," Dr. Hayes said, approaching the gurney with practiced efficiency. "Based on the imaging, this should be a straightforward procedure. We're looking at what appears to be a large lipoma, essentially a fatty tumor that's grown large enough to compress your spinal cord, 2 hours, maybe 3 at the outside." James nodded, though something in the doctor's tone suggested the case might not be as routine as his words implied. In 32 years of emergency response, James had learned to read the subtle signs of uncertainty in professionals who dealt with crisis, the slight hesitation before speaking, the way they avoided direct eye contact when they weren't entirely sure what they were facing. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the anesthesiologist, approached with her equipment cart. Her warm smile and gentle manner had put thousands of patients at ease over her 15-year career, but James caught the way she double-checked his chart, the careful attention she paid to his medical history. "Any allergies, Mr. Sullivan? Previous reactions to anesthesia?" "Nothing I know of," James replied, then paused. "Though I was in a pretty bad car accident back in '92, spent some time in the ER, but they said I was fine." Dr. Rodriguez made a note on his chart. "Sometimes old trauma can affect how the body responds to surgery. We'll monitor you closely." As they wheeled him toward the operating room, James caught a glimpse of the hallway windows revealing the city waking up below. Somewhere out there, Tommy and Katie were probably eating cereal and getting ready for school, their biggest worry whether they'd remembered their homework. Sarah would be packing lunches and checking backpacks, maintaining the normal routine that kept families anchored during crisis. The ordinary world continued its relentless march forward while he lay on a gurney, about to surrender consciousness to strangers who would cut into his body and, hopefully, fix whatever was breaking him from the inside. The operating room gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, a sterile cathedral of modern medicine where machines hummed with electronic prayers and monitors blinked with the steady rhythm of supervised life. James had been in plenty of emergency rooms over his career, sometimes as a patient, more often accompanying injured colleagues or victims he'd pulled from burning buildings. But there was something different about being the one on the table, helpless and dependent on other people's expertise. "Count backwards from 10, Mr. Sullivan," Dr. Rodriguez instructed, her voice soothing as she adjusted the IV line that would carry him into chemical sleep. 10, 9, 8. James's voice grew thick, his thoughts becoming syrupy and disconnected. "Tell my family. Tell them I love them. 7, 6. His eyes found Dr. Hayes, who was already scrubbing in at the surgical sink, reviewing the case one final time. 5, 4. The last thing James saw before darkness claimed him was the surgical team gathering around his body like guardian angels in scrubs, their movements precise and purposeful. Somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard Martha's voice calling his name. Dr. Hayes approached the operating table 45 minutes later, his hands steady and his mind focused on what should have been a routine procedure. The initial incision revealed the typical layers of skin, fat, and muscle he'd encountered thousands of times before. But as he worked deeper toward the source of James Sullivan's pain, something felt wrong. The tissue wasn't behaving as expected. Instead of the soft, yellowish mass of a typical lipoma, his scalpel encountered something harder, more resistant. The surrounding tissue showed signs of old trauma, scar tissue that had formed complex patterns around whatever was causing the compression. "More suction," he instructed the surgical nurse, trying to get a clearer view of the anomaly. That's when his scalpel hit something that definitely wasn't supposed to be inside a human body. The metallic scraping sound that echoed through the operating room made everyone freeze, their collective experience unable to explain what they'd just heard. Dr. Hayes stared into the surgical site, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing, while somewhere in the darkness of anesthesia, James Sullivan's unconscious mind began replaying memories he'd spent 32 years trying to forget. The silence in the operating room stretched like a held breath. Dr. Hayes stared into the surgical site, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with 30 years of medical experience. Embedded deep in James Sullivan's lower back, surrounded by layers of scar tissue that had formed like protective armor, was a corroded piece of metal that had no business being inside a human body. "Jenny, get me better lighting," he said quietly, his voice carefully controlled. Surgical nurse Jennifer Martinez adjusted the overhead lamps, her hands trembling slightly as she focused the beam on the anomaly. "Doctor," she whispered, "is that what I think it is?" Dr. Hayes used his forceps to gently probe the object, careful not to disturb the intricate biological cocoon that had formed around it. The metal was dark with oxidation, roughly cylindrical, and approximately 9 millimeters in diameter. His surgical training told him one thing, but his rational mind rebelled against the conclusion. "It's a bullet," he said finally, the words hanging in the sterile air like an accusation. "Doctor," Rodriguez looked up from her anesthesia monitors, her face pale above her surgical mask. "That's impossible. There's no entry wound, no indication in his medical history of gunshot trauma." "The body created a perfect encapsulation," Dr. Hayes murmured, more to himself than to his team. Look at this scar tissue formation. This didn't happen recently. Based on the oxidation and the biological response, I'd estimate this has been here for decades. The implications crashed over the surgical team like cold water. Jenny Martinez had been a nurse for 15 years, had seen gunshot victims, domestic violence cases, and every form of human trauma that found its way to a Level 1 trauma center. But she'd never encountered anything like this. A man who'd been walking around for years, apparently unaware he was carrying a bullet in his spine. "We need to notify hospital security," Dr. Hayes said, his surgical instincts warring with protocol requirements. "Any unexplained projectile injury requires police notification." "But he's still under anesthesia," Dr. Rodriguez protested. "We can't question him about this." "I know. But we also can't proceed with removal until we understand what we're dealing with. This bullet is positioned against a major blood vessel. The body's natural encapsulation might be the only thing preventing catastrophic hemorrhage." Dr. Hayes stepped back from the table, his mind racing through the medical and legal implications. In all his years of surgery, he'd removed bullets from gang members, hunting accident victims, and veterans carrying shrapnel from foreign wars. But those patients had known about their injuries, had sought treatment, had stories that explained their trauma. James Sullivan had walked into the hospital complaining of back pain with no indication that he'd ever been shot. "Keep him stable," he instructed Dr. Rodriguez. "I need to make some calls." 20 minutes later, Detective Ray Thompson of the Boston Police Department arrived at Mass General, his weathered face showing the skepticism of a man who'd heard every impossible story the city could generate. At 50, Thompson had worked enough cases to know that people lied about violence, sometimes to protect themselves, sometimes to protect others, and sometimes because trauma had a way of erasing memories that were too painful to carry. "Let me understand this," Thompson said, reviewing the surgical photos Dr. Hayes had taken. "You're telling me this man has been carrying a bullet in his back for an estimated 30 years and he doesn't know about it?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Dr. Hayes replied. "The biological response suggests long-term encapsulation. His body essentially built a protective barrier around the foreign object. It's not unheard of, but it's extremely rare, especially with something this size." Thompson studied James's medical records looking for gaps or inconsistencies. "Says here he was treated for a minor injury in March 1992 at Boston City Hospital. Listed as laceration and contusion lower back. No mention of projectile trauma." 32 years ago, Dr. Hayes calculated. That would match the estimated timeline for this encapsulation. In the family waiting room, Danny Sullivan paced between plastic chairs while Sarah tried to distract Tommy and Katie with coloring books and quiet games. The surgery had been scheduled for 2 hours. They were now approaching the 4-hour mark with no word from the medical team. The normal sounds of hospital life, intercom announcements, rolling gurneys, muted conversations, seemed amplified in the sterile space where families waited for news that would either restore their world or shatter it completely. "Maybe it was more complicated than they thought," Sarah offered, though her nursing experience told her that extended surgical time was rarely good news. Sometimes these things take longer when they get in there and see what they're really dealing with. Danny stopped pacing and turned to face his wife, his construction worker's hands clenched into fists. 4 hours, Sarah, for what they called a routine procedure. Something's wrong." 8-year-old Tommy looked up from his coloring book, his young face serious with the gravity children absorb from adult anxiety. "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" Before anyone could answer, Doc Hayes appeared in the waiting room doorway, still wearing his surgical scrubs, but with the grim expression that families learn to dread. Danny and Sarah rose simultaneously, their bodies tense with anticipation of news they weren't sure they wanted to hear. "Mr. Sullivan, Mrs. Sullivan, I need to speak with you privately," Dr. Hayes said, glancing meaningfully at the children. Sarah quickly arranged for the kids to stay with a volunteer coordinator while she and Danny followed the surgeon to a small consultation room down the hall. The space was designed for difficult conversations. Comfortable chairs, soft lighting, a box of tissues strategically placed on the side table. "Your father's surgery revealed something unexpected," Dr. Hayes began, choosing his words carefully. "We discovered a foreign object embedded in his lower back. Specifically, we found what appears to be a bullet that has been there for approximately 30 years. Danny's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of stunned comprehension. "A bullet? That's impossible. Dad would have told us if he'd been shot." "That's what makes this case so unusual," Dr. Hayes continued. "Your father's body created a biological barrier around the projectile. It's possible he experienced the initial trauma, but the severity wasn't immediately apparent. Sometimes, particularly with adrenaline and shock, people don't realize the full extent of their injuries." Sarah's nursing training kicked in, her mind processing the medical implications. "You're saying he's been walking around with a bullet in his back for 3 decades and he didn't know it? Based on the tissue response and oxidation patterns, that appears to be exactly what happened. The encapsulation process protected him from infection and major organ damage, but as he's aged, the surrounding inflammation began pressing against his spinal cord." Danny slumped into one of the consultation chairs, his mind reeling. 1992. That was around the time Mom had her cancer scare. Dad was drinking pretty heavily then, having a rough time, but he never said anything about being hurt. "Traumatic amnesia isn't uncommon in cases like this," Dr. Hayes explained. "The mind has ways of protecting itself from memories that are too difficult to process. It's possible your father experienced something so traumatic that his brain simply blocked it out." "Can you remove it?" Sarah asked, her practical nature cutting through the emotional complexity. Dr. Hayes hesitated. "That's where things get complicated. The bullet is positioned very close to a major blood vessel. The body's natural encapsulation might actually be preventing a potentially fatal hemorrhage. We need to proceed very carefully. There's something else," he continued, his expression growing more serious. "Hospital protocol requires that we notify law enforcement about any unexplained projectile injuries. Detective Thompson is here and will need to speak with your father when he wakes up." The room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of hospital activity filtering through the walls. Danny stared at his hands, trying to reconcile the father he'd known his entire life, the steady, reliable firefighter who'd raised him with unwavering moral certainty, with this new version who apparently carried secrets buried so deep that even he didn't know they existed. "When can we see him?" Danny asked finally. "He's stable but still unconscious. The anesthesia will wear off in the next hour or so. But I want to prepare you, when your father wakes up, he's going to have a lot of questions that we can't answer. This discovery is going to be as much of a shock to him as it is to you." As Dr. Hayes left them alone in the consultation room, Danny and Sarah sat in stunned silence, each processing the implications of this revelation in their own way. Somewhere in the recovery ward, James Sullivan's body was slowly metabolizing the drugs that had kept him unconscious, while strangers discovered a secret that had been literally eating him alive for over 30 years. In his drug-induced dreams, James found himself walking through smoke-filled corridors that seemed familiar but wrong, calling out for someone whose face he couldn't quite remember. A child's voice echoed from somewhere in the darkness, crying for help, and James ran toward the sound with the desperate urgency of someone who knew that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. But every time he thought he was getting closer, the corridors shifted, the smoke grew thicker, and the child's voice faded into the mechanical beeping of hospital monitors that would soon call him back to a waking world where the past and present were about to collide in ways that would change everything his family thought they knew about the man they called husband, father, and hero. James Sullivan's consciousness returned slowly, like a tide creeping up a familiar shore. The first thing he noticed was the antiseptic smell, sharp, clinical, nothing like the comforting aromas of coffee and old wood that filled his Dorchester home. The second thing was the persistent beeping of machines that seemed to be monitoring his every heartbeat, every breath, as if his body had become a stranger to itself. "Dad, can you hear me?" Danny's voice cut through the pharmaceutical fog clouding James's mind. He tried to turn his head and discovered that even that simple movement sent waves of discomfort through his neck and shoulders. The surgical site in his lower back throbbed with a different kind of pain than he'd experienced before, not the grinding ache that had plagued him for months, but something sharper, more immediate. "Where's Martha?" The words came out as a whisper, his throat dry from the intubation. For a moment, in the confusion of awakening, he'd forgotten that Martha had been gone for 3 years. The hospital environment had triggered memories of her final days, when he'd spent weeks in chairs just like the one Danny now occupied. "Dad, it's Danny. Sarah's here too. You're at Mass General. You just had surgery." Reality reasserted itself gradually. James blinked until his vision cleared, taking in the familiar faces of his son and daughter-in-law hovering beside his hospital bed. Sarah's professional composure couldn't quite hide the concern in her eyes, while Danny looked like he'd aged a decade in the few hours since James had gone under anesthesia. "How did it go?" James asked, trying to shift into a more comfortable position. "Did they get the tumor?" Danny and Sarah exchanged a look that immediately put James on alert. In 32 years of emergency response, he'd seen that expression countless times, the careful consideration that preceded the delivery of news that would change everything. "Dad, there wasn't a tumor," Danny said slowly. "There was something else, something the doctors didn't expect to find." Before James could respond, Dr. Hayes entered the room, followed by a man in a rumpled suit who carried himself with the weary authority of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. The stranger's presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room from family reunion to something more formal and unsettling. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Dr. Hayes. How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck," James replied honestly, studying the surgeon's face for clues about what had transpired during his unconscious hours. "My son says you found something unexpected." Dr. Hayes pulled up a chair, his manner suggesting this conversation would require time and patience. "Mr. Sullivan, during your surgery, we discovered a foreign object embedded in your lower back. Specifically, we found what appears to be a bullet that has been encapsulated in scar tissue for an estimated 30 years. The words hit James like physical blows. "A bullet? That's impossible. I've never been shot." "The tissue response and oxidation patterns suggest this projectile has been in your body since approximately 1992, Dr. Hayes continued. "Your body essentially built a biological protective barrier around it. It's an extremely rare occurrence, but it does happen." Detective Ray Thompson stepped forward, his notebook already open. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm Detective Thompson with Boston PD. I need to ask you some questions about this discovery." James felt the walls of the hospital room closing in around him. The faces of his family, the doctor, and the detective blurred together as his mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his own life. "I don't understand. If I'd been shot, I would remember it." "Not necessarily," Dr. Hayes interjected gently. "Traumatic amnesia is more common than people realize. The mind has ways of protecting itself from memories that are too painful or overwhelming to process." Mr. Sullivan, I've reviewed your medical records, Detective Thompson said, consulting his notes. In March 1992, you were treated at Boston City Hospital for what was described as a laceration and contusion to your lower back. Do you remember that incident? James closed his eyes, trying to reach back through 3 decades of memory. 1992 had been a blur of stress and confusion. Martha's cancer scare that turned out to be benign, his own struggles with drinking as he'd tried to cope with the possibility of losing her, long shifts at the firehouse that kept him away from home when she needed him most. That was a difficult time, he said slowly. Martha was sick. We thought it was cancer. I was drinking too much, not thinking clearly about a lot of things. I remember going to the hospital for something, but the details are fuzzy. What do you remember about the injury itself? Thompson pressed. James frowned, concentrating. Fragments of memory flickered at the edges of his consciousness. Pain, confusion, the antiseptic smell of an emergency room, a nurse with gentle hands cleaning a wound on his back. I told them I'd fallen, hit my back on something sharp. They cleaned it up, gave me some stitches, sent me home. You told them you'd fallen, Thompson repeated, making a note. But you don't remember the actual incident that caused the injury? No, James admitted, frustration bleeding into his voice. It's all blank, like trying to remember a dream after you've been awake for hours. Sarah reached out and took his hand, her nurse's training helping her recognize the signs of psychological distress. Dad, it's okay. You don't have to remember everything right now. But James was beginning to understand that the absence of memory might be more significant than any recollection. The gap in his consciousness felt deliberate, as if his mind had deliberately locked away something too dangerous or painful to confront. What kind of bullet? He asked Dr. Hayes. 9mm, based on our preliminary examination, significantly corroded, but the projectile itself is intact. The trajectory suggests it entered from a downward angle, possibly while you were in a crouched or bent position. Danny had been sitting quietly processing the medical and legal implications of his father's situation. Dad, what were you doing in March 1992? Besides work, do you remember anything specific? James searched his memory for concrete details from that time period. I was drinking at Mickey's Tavern a lot, trying to deal with the stress of your mother's health scare. Sometimes I'd walk home instead of driving. I wasn't always in condition to be behind the wheel. Which route did you usually take? Detective Thompson asked. Through Roxbury, mostly. It was a longer walk, but I needed the air to clear my head before I got home to Martha. James paused, a fragment of something stirring in the back of his mind. There was construction on Dorchester Avenue, so I'd cut through side streets. Roxbury in 1992, Thompson mused. That area was experiencing significant gang activity, drive-by shootings, territorial disputes. Do you remember encountering any violence during your walks home? No, James said, but even as the word left his mouth, he felt uncertain. The harder he tried to remember, the more elusive the memories became, like trying to grab smoke with his bare hands. But that doesn't mean anything. I was pretty drunk most nights back then. Dr. Hayes leaned forward, his expression serious. Mr. Sullivan, there's something else you need to understand about your condition. The bullet's current position is extremely precarious. It's resting against a major blood vessel, and the inflammation caused by your body's attempt to isolate it is what's been causing your back pain. The encapsulation process that saved your life 30 years ago is now threatening it. What does that mean? Danny asked. It means we need to remove the bullet, but the surgery carries significant risks. The scar tissue has grown around major blood vessels and nerve pathways. One wrong move could result in paralysis or massive hemorrhage. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. James stared at the ceiling tiles, trying to reconcile the revelation that his body had been harboring a secret that could kill him. Somewhere in the locked corridors of his memory, a story waited to be told. A story that involved violence, trauma, and decisions that had shaped the last 3 decades of his life without his conscious knowledge. "I need to remember," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever happened that night, whatever I've been hiding from myself, I need to know the truth before you cut me open again." Detective Thompson closed his notebook. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to research gang activity in Roxbury during March 1992. If there was a shooting incident involving a civilian, there should be records." Sometimes the official story and the real story aren't the same thing. As the medical team left him alone with his family, James closed his eyes and tried to push past the barriers his own mind had erected. Somewhere in the darkness of forgotten trauma, the truth was waiting, and he had the feeling that when it finally surfaced, it would change not only how he understood his past, but how his family understood the man they thought they knew. The search for truth began in the basement of James Sullivan's Dorchester home, where 45 years of accumulated memories sat in cardboard boxes that Danny had avoided sorting since Martha's death. Sarah descended the narrow wooden stairs with a flashlight, her nursing scrubs exchanged for old jeans and one of Danny's work shirts, while Tommy and Katie remained upstairs with their coloring books, blissfully unaware that their grandfather's life hung in the balance of recovered memories. "Box marked 1990-1995, Sarah called out, her voice echoing in the musty space beneath the house where Martha had stored everything she deemed too important to throw away but too painful to display. "Your mom kept everything, didn't she?" Danny joined her beside a stack of banker's boxes, each labeled in Martha's careful handwriting. The basement smelled of old wood and dampness, with hints of the lavender sachets Martha had tucked into storage containers to keep moths away from winter clothes and forgotten treasures. She said you never know when you might need to remember something exactly as it happened. The first box yielded bank statements, utility bills, and grocery receipts from the early 1990s, the mundane documentation of a family navigating financial pressures and health scares. But tucked between folders of tax documents, Sarah found something that made her breath catch. A manila envelope marked "Jimmy's Accident, March 1992, in Martha's distinctive script. "Danny, look at this." Inside the envelope were medical records from Boston City Hospital, photographs of James's back injury, and newspaper clippings that Martha had apparently saved without ever mentioning them to her husband. The photos showed a significant laceration across James's lower back, much more severe than the minor injury he remembered. The medical notes, written in a doctor's hurried handwriting, documented deep puncture wound, possible foreign object penetration, patient reports fall onto construction debris. But it was the newspaper clippings that stopped them both cold. "Local hero saves child in gang crossfire," read the Boston Globe headline from March 16, 1992. Below it, a grainy photograph showed a man carrying a small child away from what appeared to be a crime scene, but the image was too blurry to definitively identify anyone involved. Sarah read the article aloud, her voice growing quieter with each paragraph. "An unidentified man risked his own life yesterday evening to rescue an 8-year-old boy caught in crossfire between rival gangs in Roxbury. Witnesses report the man, described as middle-aged and wearing a firefighter's jacket, shielded the child with his own body before carrying him to safety. Both the rescuer and the child were treated for injuries at area hospitals. The child, Marcus Washington, is listed in stable condition. The identity of the hero remains unknown as he left the scene before police could interview him." Danny stared at the newspaper, his hands trembling slightly. Dad was wearing his off-duty BFFD jacket that night. "I remember because Martha was always after him to take it off when he went drinking," said it wasn't appropriate to represent the department in bars. They found more pieces of the puzzle in subsequent boxes. A letter from the fire department commending James for heroic actions while off duty, though it provided no specifics. A receipt from a dry cleaner for blood stain removal from a leather jacket. And most telling of all, a bottle of pain medication prescribed to James Sullivan on March 17, 1992, with instructions for management of severe back trauma. "She knew," Sarah whispered, holding up a piece of paper that made everything clear, a handwritten note from Martha, dated a week after the incident. "Jimmy came home bleeding but won't tell me what happened. Says he helped someone but doesn't want to talk about it. The news said a firefighter saved a little boy from gang violence. I know it was him. I know my husband. But he's drinking more, having nightmares, and I think remembering hurts him more than the physical wound. I won't push. Some wounds need time to heal in darkness." Meanwhile, back at Mass General, James lay in his hospital bed struggling with fragments of memory that felt like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle scattered by wind. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard sounds that didn't quite make sense. A child crying, gunshots echoing off brick buildings, his own voice shouting something he couldn't quite recall. Dr. Hayes had explained that the bullet's removal would require delicate microsurgery, with risks that included paralysis, massive bleeding, or death. The encapsulation process that had protected James for 30 years had also made the projectile nearly impossible to extract safely. They would need to wait for the surgical swelling to subside before attempting the procedure, giving James time he wasn't sure he wanted to confront the truth. Detective Thompson returned to the hospital late that afternoon with a thick file folder and the grim expression of a man who'd found more answers than anyone had bargained for. He sat down beside James's bed and opened the folder carefully, as if the contents might escape if handled carelessly. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been researching gang activity in Roxbury during March 1992. There was indeed a shooting incident on March 14th involving rival drug dealers. According to witnesses, an 8-year-old boy named Marcus Washington was caught in the crossfire while walking home from school." James felt something stir in the depths of his memory. A child's face, terrified eyes, small hands grasping at his jacket. "Marcus Washington," he repeated, and the name felt familiar on his tongue. The shooting occurred at approximately 6:30 p.m. on Tremont Street near the corner of Malcolm X Boulevard. Multiple witnesses reported that an adult male, later described as wearing a Boston Fire Department jacket, intervened to protect the child. The man was struck by gunfire but managed to carry the boy to safety before disappearing from the scene. The pieces were falling into place now, though James still couldn't access the complete memory. Was the child hurt? Minor injuries. He spent 2 days in the hospital and made a full recovery. But here's what's interesting, Mr. Sullivan. I managed to track down Marcus Washington. He's now a successful civil rights attorney with a practice in downtown Boston. He's been looking for his rescuer for 30 years. James felt tears forming in his eyes, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The emotional weight of the revelation seemed to bypass his conscious mind and strike directly at something deeper, a recognition of heroism he'd forgotten he possessed, buried beneath years of ordinary life and the gradual erosion of time. "He wants to see you," Detective Thompson continued. "When you're ready, he says he owes his life to you, and he's never forgotten the man who ran into gunfire to save a stranger's child." As Detective Thompson left the room, James closed his eyes and tried to reach past the barriers his mind had erected. For the first time in decades, the memories didn't retreat when he approached them. Instead, they began to surface slowly, like objects rising from the depths of dark water. A crying child, the sharp crack of gunshots, the weight of a small body in his arms, and his own voice, steady and calm despite the chaos. "It's okay, son. I've got you. You're safe now." The truth was finally coming home, and with it, the understanding that sometimes the most important things we do are the ones we're too humble or too traumatized to remember. Marcus Washington stepped off the elevator at Mass General Hospital with the measured confidence of a man who'd spent 15 years arguing cases in federal court. But his hands trembled slightly as he approached room 314. At 40 years old, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd overcome significant obstacles to achieve success. Yet traces of the frightened 8-year-old boy he'd once been flickered in his dark eyes as he prepared to meet the man who'd saved his life 32 years ago. The meeting had been arranged through Detective Thompson, who'd served as intermediary between two men whose lives had intersected in violence and heroism 3 decades earlier. Marcus had canceled 2 important depositions to make this visit, telling his secretary only that he needed to settle an old debt. The truth was more complicated. He'd spent half his adult life wondering about the identity of the stranger who'd risked everything to protect a child he didn't know. James was sitting up in his hospital bed when Marcus entered the room, his weathered face showing the strain of recent surgery and the emotional upheaval of recovered memories. The 2 men studied each other across the span of 3 decades, each seeing reflections of that terrifying March evening when their lives had become permanently intertwined. "Mr. Sullivan," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the controlled emotion of someone accustomed to maintaining professional composure even in personal moments. "I've been waiting 32 years to thank you." James looked at this successful attorney, impeccably dressed, articulate, confident, and tried to reconcile the image with his fragmentary memories of a terrified child cowering behind a parked car. "I'm sorry," he said honestly. "I wish I could say I remember everything clearly, but there are still gaps." Marcus moved closer to the bed, pulling up the visitor's chair that Danny had occupied for most of the past 2 days. "Maybe I can help fill in some of those gaps. I remember everything about that night, every detail. It's not the kind of experience you forget." As Marcus began to speak, the memories started flowing back to James with increasing clarity, as if his visitor's words were keys unlocking doors that had been sealed for decades. "It was March 14th, 1992. I was walking home from school. I was 8 years old, in 3rd grade at the Martin Luther King Elementary School. My mother worked 2 jobs, so I usually walked home alone. The route took me through some rough neighborhoods, but we lived in a small apartment on Tremont Street, and it was the shortest way." James nodded, fragments of the scene beginning to reconstruct themselves in his mind. He could almost see the narrow street, lined with triple-decker houses and corner stores that sold lottery tickets and cigarettes to anyone with money. "There was a territorial dispute between 2 drug crews," Marcus continued. "I didn't understand the politics of it at the time. I just knew that sometimes grown men would yell at each other, and sometimes there would be loud noises that sent everyone running. That afternoon I was walking past the corner of Tremont and Malcolm X when the shooting started." The sound of gunfire echoed in James's memory now, sharp cracks that reverberated off brick walls and sent people diving for cover behind cars and into doorways. He remembered being half drunk, walking off another evening at Mickey's Tavern, when the chaos erupted around him. "You were coming out of the corner store," Marcus said, watching James's face for signs of recognition. "Mrs. Chen's Market. You'd bought milk. I remember because the gallon jug broke when you dropped it to help me. I was trapped behind a blue Honda Civic and the gunfire was coming from both directions. I was screaming, certain I was going to die." James felt the memory slam back into full focus with overwhelming intensity. The blue Honda, its paint faded, and one taillight cracked. The child crouched behind it, his school backpack still strapped to his shoulders, tears streaming down his face as bullets whistled overhead, the instinctive decision that changed both their lives. "I ran toward you," James said quietly, the words coming from some deep place of recovered truth. "I didn't think about it. I just saw a kid in trouble and moved." "You didn't hesitate," Marcus confirmed. "Not for a second. You dropped that milk jug and sprinted straight into the line of fire. I remember thinking, this man must be crazy. He's running toward the shooting instead of away from it." The physical sensations returned now. The burn in his lungs as he ran, the sharp pain as something struck his back, the desperate strength that allowed him to scoop up a terrified child and carry him to safety. James remembered his own voice, steady and calm despite the chaos. "Get behind me, kid. I've got you. You're safe now." "The bullet hit you as you were covering me with your body," Marcus said. "I felt you jerk from the impact, but you didn't let go. You carried me 3 blocks to safety, even though you were bleeding." "I remember getting you to the ambulance," James said, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. "The paramedics wanted to treat me too, but I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I told them I was fine, that I'd get checked out later." "But you didn't go to the hospital right away, did you?" James shook his head. "I was drunk, scared. I drove myself home and tried to clean up the wound. It wasn't until the next day, when I couldn't stop the bleeding, that Martha forced me to go to the emergency room. By then, I was in shock, confused. I told them I'd fallen onto some construction debris." Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn photograph, a copy of the newspaper image that had run in the Boston Globe 32 years earlier. "I kept this all these years. My grandmother framed it and hung it in our apartment. She used to tell me, 'That man is your guardian angel, Marcus. Someday you'll find him and thank him properly.'" James studied the blurry image, seeing himself as he'd been 3 decades ago, younger, stronger, carrying a small child away from violence. The man in the photograph looked like a hero, though James had never thought of himself that way. "After that night, everything changed for me," Marcus continued. "My grandmother moved us out of Roxbury. We went to live with relatives in Brookline, where the schools were better and the streets were safer. She said God had sent you to save me for a reason, and it was my responsibility to make something good come from that miracle." "What happened to your mother?" James asked. Marcus's expression grew sad. "She died 2 years later, cancer, but she lived long enough to see me start high school, to know I was going to make it. My grandmother raised me after that, always talking about the stranger who'd risked his life for a kid he didn't know." The conversation was interrupted by Danny and Sarah's arrival, carrying coffee and sandwiches from the hospital cafeteria. They stopped short when they saw Marcus, recognizing immediately that this was the child from the newspaper story, now grown, successful, and sitting beside their father's hospital bed like an old friend. "Danny, Sarah," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'd like you to meet Marcus Washington, the boy I forgot I saved." Marcus stood and extended his hand to Danny, his professional bearing softening into something more personal. "Your father saved my life. Everything I've accomplished, everything I've become, it's all because he decided that a stranger's child was worth risking his own life to protect." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes, her nursing background helping her understand the medical miracle they were witnessing. "Dad, do you remember now? Do you remember what happened that night?" James nodded, feeling simultaneously drained and enlightened by the recovery of his buried memories. "I remember all of it. The shooting, carrying Marcus to safety, getting hit by that bullet. I remember thinking that if I could just get him out of there, nothing else mattered." "That's what heroes do," Marcus said simply. "They don't think about themselves. They just act when someone needs help. You gave me my life back that night, Mr. Sullivan. Now I want to return the favor." He reached into his briefcase again and pulled out a legal document that he placed on James's hospital tray table. "I've been successful in my career, largely because of the opportunities that came from surviving that night. I want to cover all your medical expenses, the surgery, the recovery, everything. It's not charity, Mr. Sullivan." It's a debt I've owed for 32 years. James stared at the legal papers, overwhelmed by the generosity and the closing of a circle he'd never realized was incomplete. The boy he'd saved had grown up to become the man who would save him in return, and the bullet that had nearly killed them both would finally be removed by hands guided by love, gratitude, and the enduring power of one moment of courage that had echoed across 3 decades. 6 months after the surgery that removed a 32-year-old bullet from his spine, James Sullivan stood before a gathering of 200 people in the Boston Fire Department Ceremonial Hall, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in 4 years. The navy blue fabric still fit perfectly, though the man inside it had been transformed by the recovery of memories he'd spent 3 decades forgetting. The medal ceremony had been Marcus Washington's idea, though he'd worked through official channels to make it happen. The Boston Fire Department, the mayor's office, and the Roxbury Community Center had collaborated to create an event that honored not just James's heroism, but the ripple effects of courage that had touched countless lives over the intervening years. Mayor Patricia Chen, daughter of the corner store owner who'd witnessed the original incident, stepped to the podium with the kind of gravity reserved for moments when a community acknowledges its finest examples of human decency. Today, we honor a man who exemplifies the best of what it means to serve others, not just in uniform but as a human being who sees someone in need and acts without hesitation. James sat in the front row beside Martha's empty chair, a deliberate choice by Danny and Sarah, who understood that his late wife's presence should be acknowledged in this moment of recognition. Tommy and Katie flanked their grandfather, 8-year-old Tommy wearing a miniature firefighter's helmet that the department had given him, while 6-year-old Katie clutched a handmade card that read, "My Hero Grandpa," in purple crayon. The ceremony had drawn an unexpected crowd. Retired firefighters from Engine Company 33 sat alongside community leaders from Roxbury, legal colleagues of Marcus Washington, and neighbors from Dorchester who'd known the Sullivan family for decades. Mrs. Chen, now in her 80s, occupied a place of honor in the second row, her weathered hands folded over a purse that contained the original newspaper clipping from 1992, yellow with age but still treasured. The Medal of Valor we present today recognizes not just a single act of heroism, but a lifetime of service that began long before March 14, 1992, and continues to inspire new generations, Mayor Chen continued. Captain James Sullivan's actions that night saved the life of 8-year-old Marcus Washington, but the true measure of his heroism lies in how that single moment of courage has multiplied over the years. Marcus approached the podium when his turn came to speak, his successful attorney's composure barely containing the emotion that had built over months of planning this recognition. At 40, he carried himself with quiet confidence, but traces of the frightened child he'd once been flickered in his eyes as he looked out at the assembled crowd. 32 years ago, I was walking home from school when violence erupted around me. I was 8 years old, terrified, certain I was going to die on a street corner in Roxbury. Then a stranger appeared, a man who chose to run toward danger instead of away from it, who decided that the life of a child he'd never met was worth risking his own safety. The audience listened in respectful silence as Marcus recounted the story that had shaped both their lives, his voice growing stronger as he described James's unhesitating courage. Captain Sullivan didn't know me. He didn't know my name, my family, my circumstances. He just saw a child in danger and acted with the kind of moral clarity that defines true heroism. James found himself thinking about Martha as Marcus spoke, wishing she could witness this moment when the past and present finally aligned in recognition of something good. She'd known the truth all along, had protected his traumatized psyche by allowing him to forget until he was strong enough to remember, and had quietly supported the Washington family's recovery through anonymous contributions that James was only now learning about. But the story doesn't end with rescue, Marcus continued. Because of Captain Sullivan's actions, I survived to be raised by my grandmother, who moved us to a safer neighborhood and insisted that I honor the gift of life by making something meaningful of it. I went to college on scholarships, earned my law degree, and built a practice dedicated to helping people who need someone to fight for them. The ripple effects of that March night had indeed spread far beyond the original incident. Marcus's law firm, Sullivan Associates Legal Aid, named in honor of his rescuer, had provided free legal services to hundreds of families facing eviction, discrimination, and injustice. 3 of his former clients sat in the audience today, successful professionals who credited Marcus's intervention with changing the trajectory of their lives. Tommy tugged on James's uniform sleeve and whispered loudly enough for several rows to hear, "Grandpa, are you famous now?" James smiled and ruffled his grandson's hair. "No, buddy. I'm just a guy who did what anyone should do when someone needs help." But even as he spoke those words, James understood that the ceremony represented something larger than individual recognition. It was a community's affirmation that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things, that split-second decisions made in crisis could echo across decades, and that heroism often wore the everyday clothes of neighbors, fathers, and public servants. Father Michael O'Connor, who'd ministered to the Sullivan family through Martha's illness and death, offered the invocation with words that captured the spiritual dimension of the day's recognition. We gather not just to honor courage, but to celebrate the mysterious ways that God works through human hands and hearts to create connections that transcend time and circumstance. When James finally approached the podium to accept his medal, he carried with him a speech Sarah had helped him write, though he found himself setting aside his prepared remarks in favor of words that came from a deeper place. I stand here today not as a hero, but as a man who's been blessed with family, community, and the opportunity to make a difference in someone else's life. My wife Martha, who passed away 3 years ago, always said that we're put on this earth to look out for each other. She was right about that, as she was right about most things. His voice grew stronger as he continued, drawing strength from the faces in the audience. Danny and Sarah beaming with pride, Tommy and Katie listening with the rapt attention children reserve for important grown-up moments, Marcus Washington nodding encouragement from the front row. 32 years ago, I made a choice that I later forgot I'd made, but forgetting doesn't diminish the power of choosing to help when help is needed. Every one of you faces those same choices every day. Chances to intervene when someone is struggling, to stand up when someone is being treated unfairly, to extend kindness when the world feels cold. The medal itself was simple, a bronze star suspended from a blue ribbon with an inscription that read, "For courage above and beyond." But its significance lay not in the metal and fabric, but in what it represented. A community's recognition that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary moments. As applause filled the ceremonial hall, James thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the decades of forgotten heroism, the medical crisis that had forced remembering, the reunion with Marcus Washington, and the gradual understanding that his actions had created a legacy extending far beyond anything he'd imagined. The reception afterward took place in the fire station's apparatus bay, where Engine 33 and Ladder 19 had been moved aside to make room for tables laden with food donated by local restaurants. Mrs. Chen presented James with a framed photograph, a recent picture of him and Marcus together, standing in front of the corner store where their lives had intersected 3 decades earlier. "This goes beside the old newspaper picture," she told him in accented English that had softened but never disappeared during her 50 years in Boston. "So people remember that heroes live in neighborhoods, not just in movies." Marcus found James near the end of the evening when most of the crowd had dispersed and only family and close friends remained. "There's something else I want to tell you," he said, his usual professional composure replaced by something more personal. "My wife and I have 2 children, a son who's 7 and a daughter who's 5. We've told them your story since they were old enough to understand. They know that sometimes strangers help strangers, and that courage is something you do, not something you are. James felt tears forming in his eyes as he understood the full scope of his legacy. "What are their names?" "James and Martha," Marcus replied simply. "We wanted them to carry forward the names of the people who made their father's life possible." As the evening wound down, and James prepared to return home to his Dorchester brownstone, he realized that the bullet's removal had accomplished more than just physical healing. The recovery of his forgotten heroism had restored something essential, not just his own sense of purpose, but his family's understanding of the values that had shaped their lives. Tommy fell asleep in the car on the way home, his firefighter's helmet tilted at an angle that reminded James of his own early days with the department. Katie drowsed against Sarah's shoulder, still clutching her crayon drawing of My Hero Grandpa. In the quiet of the vehicle, surrounded by family, and filled with the warm afterglow of recognition, James understood that heroism wasn't about remembering brave moments. It was about being ready for the next time someone needed help. The bullet was gone, the memories were restored, and the ripples of one moment of courage continued to spread through the lives of children who would grow up knowing that strangers sometimes risk everything to protect each other. It was, James thought as they pulled into the familiar driveway on Dorchester Street, exactly the kind of legacy Martha would have wanted him to leave. Sometimes the most important chapters of our lives are written in moments we've forgotten, buried beneath years of ordinary days and quiet struggles. James Sullivan thought he was just a retired firefighter with chronic back pain, but hidden within his body was a 32-year-old secret, a bullet that held the key to a heroic act he'd completely forgotten. When surgeons discovered this mystery, it unlocked not just memories of saving a child's life, but the profound truth that our choices echo across decades in ways we never imagine. That 8-year-old boy grew up to become a successful attorney who spent 30 years searching for his rescuer, proving that one moment of courage can ripple through generations. For those of us in our golden years, this story reminds us that our seemingly small acts of kindness, bravery, and compassion may have changed lives in ways we'll never fully know. The legacy we leave isn't always measured in grand gestures. Sometimes it's found in the stranger we helped, the neighbor we checked on, or the moment we chose to act when someone needed us most. Our forgotten heroisms may be the very foundation upon which others built their dreams. Questions for reflection. What moments from your past might have made a bigger impact than you realized? Have you ever wondered about someone whose life you briefly touched but never saw again? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear about the unsung heroes in your own life.